Alrighty, and good morning. Welcome to our little broadcast here this morning. It's Sunday morning, it's the end of January. The planets are aligning, and it is super sunny down here in Durban with no rain expected for the whole week. So we are burning up here. No surprise, Tori just got out the pool behind me just to make sure that nobody sees her in there. But now you know what she does while I'm working. Anyway, we're busy with Exodus through ancient eyes, and truly it feels like 40 years in the wilderness. That's how long it's taken us. Some of the stuff is a little bit mundane, some of it is a little bit, let's move on. And some of it is quite exciting, but you need all of it. You need the steak and the vegetables to make a balanced meal. In other words, to create a balanced view of what is left for us in the book of Exodus, you kind of have to have a bit of everything. Oh, great, thanks, Tara. Come to the side, babes. All right. Today, in my opinion, is one of the more exciting little bits of information. Something which I never ever considered as a pastor for 20 years, reading these scriptures often and preaching from them very, very often. And this is the issue regarding Aaron's golden calf, right? I spent a lot of time trying to figure out where the golden calf idea comes from, and I don't want to jump the gun now, because first we have to deal briefly with the creation of the tabernacle, and so I think let's do that first, and then we can get to Aaron's little pet. Okay. When we get to the making of the tabernacle, there's plenty amount of chapters dedicated to this tabernacle. Why was this so important? Well, in retrospect, it seems like the idea of the tabernacle seems to be the way in which God moves from the mountain of Sinai or Horeb and then travels with the people. In other words, and this is quite interesting, it's something to really consider, that the tabernacle becomes a portable Sinai. Now, up until this time, if you will, God lives on this mountain. This is where Moses encounters him every single time. So the idea that God would live somewhere else is actually quite novel in the story. And where will God live? He will live inside of this temple, right? Or this tabernacle. And he will travel with this mode of transport all the way into Jerusalem, where finally Solomon would build a massive and beautiful temple for him. And there he would put his footstool forever. And so in the larger narrative, we have to see the tabernacle as God's way of getting from Sinai to the temple. Now, for modern Christians, this is a slightly strange idea because God is everywhere and he is spirit and he doesn't need a temple. Yeah, that's our view, but that was not the view of the people who wrote these texts. To them, God was very much, in some sense, a deity that needed to be located and that needed a temple, albeit no images were to be created. So in this sense, the tabernacle is a very strong focal point of the book of Exodus, of course, and it takes on some of the features of Mount Sinai. For instance, Mount Sinai can be divided into three parts: the footstool, the bottom where people can stand around but not cross. Then you have the middle part, is where Moses and the elders go for a meal. The 70 elders appointed according to Moses' father-in-law, the Midianite priest. They go up there, they go eat with God. It's kind of like it's written as if they're having a meal with God. But they can't go up to the summit, and they kind of have to leave, as that's implied, I guess, by the scripture, by the verses, that they have to leave back down. And it's only Moses that can go into this top summit. In other words, you have three parts with restricted access, and that's exactly what we find in the tabernacle and eventually in the temple as well, that we have the outer court, the holy place, and the most holy place. For those of you who know the temple architecture, you'll immediately understand what I'm talking about. And then there's some other features that scholars believe that the tabernacle itself and even the temple is again drawing us back to the very cosmic imagery from the beginning of Genesis. I don't necessarily want to go into too much about that today. It's something that can be studied on its own. But I think it is important to understand that Moses goes up into the summit of this mountain, and then eventually comes down, of course, and they build this tabernacle. And this tabernacle is the way in which God travels with them, all the way into Canaan. Of course, here and there, especially in the episode we're about to discuss, God says, I'm not coming anymore. Like, you guys can go on your own, I'm not going. And Moses basically has to mediate between the people and God to convince, and he eventually does put forth an argument that convinces God. It's just really strange that Moses has a better argument than God. So Moses' better argument convinces God to eventually again travel with the Israelites all the way into Canaan. So I don't want to go into the imagery from the temple, but there's a lot of things in the temple: the showbread, the table of showbread, the incense altar, the brazen altar, the most holy place with the ark, which is like the throne or the mercy seat, with the cherubim that guards or stands up and over it. A lot of it is believed to be drawn once again from cosmic imagery from the creation account that we find in Genesis, just like we found this type of language used for the Red Sea crossing, for the Exodus out of Egypt, etc. And also, of course, the flood in Genesis. That's not going to be our focus here today, but I would like to move on then to one of the interesting stories about the Israelites leaving Egypt. After Moses comes down after this meal with the elders, they kind of like seal the deal with a meal. Meals were incredibly important in ancient times. In fact, in the surrounding nations, as far as we know, the gods were offered meals, and they were understood to be eating these meals as a form of sacrifice, and this was a way in which people would appease the gods. And so a meal would always be a sign of sacrifice, of worship, but also possibly in this case a sealing the deal that Israel's going to be God's people. They're going to live by these laws, and they're going to be obedient to him, and he's going to protect them, and he's going to take them into this very beautiful land, the promised land that overflows with milk and honey. And as long as they are obedient to him, he's going to make them prosper there, and he's going to turn them into a kingdom of priests. Of course, the opposite is also true, that if they don't obey him, if they disobey him, he's going to destroy them. He's going to do things to them, according to Deuteronomy, that will make them think they're back in Egypt and they are the Egyptians. So what could the Israelites possibly do to upset God? Well, just the next minute, while Moses is on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, which again is a very symbolic number, it's a time of testing, I guess, for the Israelites, maybe also for Moses, but at least for the Israelites, in which things go really and drastically wrong down at the bottom. While Moses is on top, the people are murmuring. Aaron is kind of representative down at the bottom. Of course, Aaron here, as we have said in these previous chapters, is kind of his high priesthood is legitimized by an extended genealogy about him being like the prophet, the mouthpiece for Moses, and being called up into the mountain, of course. So here he is, kind of leading the people as a priest or a high priest, the only priest, I guess, at this point. So we don't really have an official priesthood established yet, as far as I can see. People are coming to Aaron, and they are moaning about Moses not being there. And the thing that happens next has baffled me for so long. People take things in their own hands, right? They gather around Aaron, or against, whichever way you want to see it, and they get him to make them an idol. Now, they just received the 10 Commandments, which say, "You shall have no other gods before me, and you will make no graven images." And here we go. They're making this graven image. So it's quite unclear whether the people makes it or Aaron makes it. Sometimes it seems like it's the people's fault. Other times it seems like it's Aaron's fault. Other times Aaron kind of denies that he actually made it. But anyway, story goes more or less that they brought all their gold together, and Aaron then fashioned a golden calf, like a calf, a bull. It's a cow type of thing, right? And they make one out of gold. Now, how big this thing would have been, how much gold they would have had, if you believe that the Israelites were 1 million in number, which is most probably not true, then a couple of earrings could, could make a substantial calf. I don't know whether they'd be carrying gold with them. Highly improbable. But anyway, the point is that they make this golden calf out of gold they get from somewhere. And I've always wondered why are they making a calf? Now, my first thought and my default position has kind of always been they are possibly mimicking some form of Egyptian worship. Remember, according to the story, they were in Egypt for 400 years, which means they were thoroughly paganized in that time. Now there is the bull god, or the god Memphis, that was represented by a bull in Egypt. So I always thought, maybe they were mimicking this kind of idol. But some weird things happen in this little story that has raised the eyebrows of scholars for a very, very long time. And I'm going to try and point them out as simply as I can today. So they gather around, they make this golden calf. Here's some of the interesting things that happen. Once the calf is finished, the people declare, I'm quoting here from Exodus 32, 4-5. The people declare, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Okay. And after this, Aaron builds an altar. So he's building an altar for this thing, and they're about to enter some cultic practices here, sacrifices, etc. And Aaron says, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to Yahweh." What? So there's two things that are there's three things that are really, really strange here. Number one, that after receiving this law that says you won't make an image, they already making images, and they have already declaring that these are the gods that brought them out of Egypt. Sure, these people have a really short memory, or there's something really wrong with them, or there's something else going on here. Now, the first thing it raises our curiosity here is when they say, "These are your gods, O Israel," plural. Hello. The story says quite explicitly that there's one calf that was fashioned. Why does the narrative quote say, "These are your gods"? What does that mean? So that's the first point that needs to be raised. The second point to be raised is that they're saying that it's these gods that brought them out of Egypt. Now, you would have to be stupid to not realize that it was Yahweh that brought you out of Egypt. Moses showed you the plagues. He showed you getting through the Red Sea. He showed you manna. He brought you to this fearsome mountain. You would really have to be stupid to try and say that there is some other god, a calf god, that brought you out of Egypt. Now, this is further. Okay, let me rather say it this way. There is an argument to be made that in some way this calf was representative of Yahweh or his throne. Then it would make sense, number one, that they believed that these were the gods or /God that brought them out of Egypt, right? We could make sense of that. And then we'd also, further to this, it would make more sense that that Aaron then says, "Tomorrow we will have a festival to the Lord," right? So just on face value, looking at these two things, we struggle to make sense of "these are your gods" with his one calf, but we can make sense of the idea that if the calf was in some way representative of Yahweh, that the statement that "these are your gods that brought you out of Egypt" makes sense, and also that this will be a festival to the Lord. Tomorrow it'll be a festival to Yahweh. All right, so is there a way to connect Yahweh to the idea of a calf? Well, actually there is. If we understand that the idea of El, the word for God, but there was also, of course, the Canaanite high god was El, is connected to the idea of a bull, right? So the word for God has a bull, strength of a bull kind of connected to it. So there is a possibility, if we just from what we see here, that in some way the Israelites understood God, or any god that is so powerful like El to be like a bull, and they use this imagery to represent Yahweh because Moses disappeared. Moses bailed on them, and now they got no representative besides Aaron, and they strong-arm Aaron into making them something that represents Yahweh. So this would make sense of this situation, that actually Aaron is strong-armed into making a representative model of Yahweh that brought them out of Egypt, and they're going to have a festival for him because Moses disappeared. Right? So this kind of makes sense, barring the fact that they were explicitly instructed not to make a type of image. But it still doesn't make sense of the idea that Aaron here says, or the people here declare, these are your gods, plural. Okay, so there's a couple of things here. Let me just read through my notes here quickly, as I've ad-libbed most of this. The festival is a bad idea. It's basically worship, a worship service complete with an awesome meal, and possibly some sexual carousing. They replace God with an image, or like we've just said, they make an image of God or some representative of God. Violating the first two commandments of their contract, they accept it. This is not going to end well if you know the Yahweh of Exodus. Also, why does it say these are your gods, plural? Didn't he just make one God? And here I want to introduce something which I guess a lot of us do know about, but to connect these two things is not something I did as a pastor, but I've realized that scholars have been connecting these two scenarios for a very, very long time. There is another mention of the making of bull calves, and we'll just call them calves for now, golden calves, by Israelites later on in 1 Kings. Now, just a little bit of a, let me just mention his name. The king who did this was the king of the northern tribes, Israel, the 10 northern tribes, Jeroboam. Now, Jeroboam is infamous in the Bible for creating high places, and one of the things he did is in order to prevent his people from the northern kingdom to come down to Jerusalem, which was in the southern kingdom of Judah, to come and worship, because of course he was at odds with his brother. I think his brother was Rehoboam, the two sons of Solomon, of course. He would place two golden calves, one in Ben, got to get this right, sorry, is it Ben? No, it's not Ben, it's Bethel and Dan. So Dan was at the northern part of the northern Israel, and Bethel, I think, at the southern part of northern Israel. And he would place two of these golden calves to be worshipped by the Israelites. Now, these Israelites were the Israelites of the northern kingdom. They were worshiping Yahweh. And it stands to reason that they were worshiping Yahweh in the form of this type of a golden calf. But it is very interesting that this is the other episode of the creation of golden calves in the Bible. All right, so the question is, biblical scholars are, the point is that biblical scholars are virtually united in seeing that Exodus 32, Aaron's golden calf, has way more to do with Jeroboam than actual Aaron. All right, so hold on, what does that mean? Okay, so firstly, the sentence, these are your gods, makes no sense in Aaron's situation because it was a single calf, right? The writer seems to be alerting us to the other episode, which is the one from Jeroboam in which two calves were made, right? The writer seems to be alerting us to this reality. The founding of the Northern Kingdom and the establishment of its rival worship centers is as bad as the golden calf episode, which was really bad indeed. All right, so now we just for perspective, for those who don't know, Jeroboam comes after Solomon, after David, after Solomon. So we're looking at probably the 8th century or early 9th century BC. The Aaron episode with the calf was supposed to have happened quite early on, so probably 1200 BC. So they separated by about 300 years. The one is much later, Jeroboam, and the one is supposed to be much earlier, which is the one of Aaron. Let me read this little side note on the golden calf. Right. So After the 10 northern tribes refused to accept Solomon's son Rehoboam as their king down in Judah, Jeroboam was installed as king of the northern kingdom of Israel in 1 Kings 12 verse 20. He then goes and he erects these golden calves at Bethel and Dan in 1 Kings 12, 26 to 23. You can go read about it. He believed that it is too much trouble for his people to travel down into Jerusalem to worship at the temple. Also a good political choice to keep them from the southern kingdom's political and religious influence. At this point, southern and northern kingdoms are at odds with one another, right? He may have been motivated to return more to the traditional worship which have been tied to various shrines in the north. I mean, know the northern kingdom of Israel is notorious for older forms of Yahweh worship. We have found other temples, for instance, dedicated to Yahweh in these areas. For instance, in a place like Shiloh, where the tabernacle was supposed to be have been erected after coming from Egypt. And several other sites are also associated with the patriarchs, such as Abraham. When he sets up these golden calves, plural, he proclaims. Now, this is where, like, up until this point, you might say, okay, but this is a stretch. And here's, for me, kind of like part of the clincher of this. The proclamation of Jeroboam in 1 Kings sounds almost exactly like the proclamation by the people in Exodus when it comes to the golden calves. Listen what Jeroboam proclaims 300 years later, right, than the supposed Aaron calf story. Once he's made these golden calves, plural, at Dan and Bethel. He says, "Look, Israel, here are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt." Now, guys, this is almost identical to the words that that Aaron, or the words that are attributed to Aaron when he fashions the golden calf while Moses is up the mountain. He says, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt," in Exodus 32 verse 4. So this is crazy. How can these two passages, how can these two declarations be so similar? Did Aaron and Jeroboam really declare these exact words? Or is one of the other the original? In other words, there's two scenarios that could possibly have happened, right? Aaron did say these exact things and Jeroboam copied him later. Or Jeroboam was the one who said this first, and the writers of Exodus, who writes at least 200 to 300 to 400 years after Jeroboam, is using the Jeroboam situation and projecting it back onto Aaron. One of the main reasons that scholars believe that the Aaron account is actually copying the writers of Exodus that are writing this account of Aaron's calf. The reason why they believe it's copying Jeroboam is because they copy it incorrectly. It's Jeroboam's situation that validates the Israel, here are your gods, because there's more than one calf. The Aaron situation should not say, Israel, here are your gods. It should say, Israel, here is your God. In other words, the writers copied Jeroboam's exclamation and placed it on the lips of an earlier Aaron, not changing the plural from gods to God. Now, was this a mistake? Possibly. Or was it there deliberately to make the people of the exile remember the horrible things that Jeroboam did and to show that this was first done by Aaron? In other words, when someone would read Exodus, the God's plural was left there deliberately because any reader of the Exodus would also possibly know Kings, in which Jeroboam did exactly the same thing. Right? So most scholars then say that what has happened here is that Jeroboam first uttered these words according to 1 Kings, right? How accurate it is not we're not talking about that. But that the writers of Exodus was placing the blame for Jeroboam's actions back onto the Aaronic priesthood. What complicates things further, or actually in some sense it brings more light to what's going on here, is to remember that the priesthood of the Northern Kingdom, as far as we understand, were Aaron's priesthood, or descended from Aaron. But the priesthoods in Judah at the time of David and Solomon and later on were not Aaronic priests. But they were, a name you would have heard a lot, they were Zadokites. So there were two competing priesthoods during this time, one in the temple in the south and one for these high places, shrines, and golden calves in the north. And as with much of the Torah, scholars believe that it is writings from the north and the south that had to be harmonized or put together when we put the Torah together. Because when these nations became one eventually, they had to take the sacred scriptures from both sides, north and south, and bring them into harmony. For this reason, they say that the story about Aaron and the golden calf is a story that comes from the south that tries to delegitimize the Aaronic priesthood because it was from the north, and in that sense legitimize the Zadokite priesthood. So that's a little bit complicated and technical. Let me get back to my notes and see if I can make a little bit more sense of that. On the surface, it appears that Jeroboam is echoing from the story of Aaron that was imitating him. However, there are some puzzling considerations with this view. Aaron uses, as we've said, the plural gods for what is explicitly mentioned as one calf. This doesn't work. What's going on? Someone's making a mistake or a deliberate mistake. Also, this story vilifies Aaron, which is against the trend we find in Exodus, which generally legitimizes Aaron as the high priest of the Israelites, right? The rest of Exodus celebrates him as the first high priest. Why would a single author do both? Villainize Aaron and celebrate him at the same time. Here's some more parallels. There's two particular parallels between the Jeroboam story and the Aaron story of the calves that make scholars believe, and I truly also believe this, two pieces of evidence to show that these stories are definitely related to one another. The first one is, besides the almost word-for-word exclamation that is made by Jeroboam and the people at Aaron's calf, Jeroboam's son, listen to this, is called Abiah and Nadab. Guess what Aaron's sons are called? Abihu and Nadab. Coincidence? No ways. Literally, one of these names is different by only one vowel. They sound almost exactly the same. What are the chances that someone, a king who lived as a son of Solomon, had basically the exact same names for his two sons as what Aaron had for his two sons, and that these calf episodes come from both of them, and that they say the exact same thing? Oh, Israel, these are your gods that let you out of Egypt. This is not a coincidence. There's definitely some copying going on. The only question that's kind of left for us to talk about is which was actually original. The second piece of evidence here is that in Deuteronomy 9 verse 21, Aaron destroys the image by burning it with fire. Now, obviously, Moses is mad. He loses it completely. So Aaron destroys the image. He burns it with fire. Then he crushes it. He grinds it until it is reduced to dust. Now, dust. Surprise, surprise. Later in the story in Kings, Josiah destroys the high place on the site where Jeroboam's image had stood by burning it and crushing it to dust. This happens in 2 Kings 23:15. This phrase, crushing it to dust, occurs in both stories, but very rarely anywhere else in the Bible. This does not seem like a coincidence. In other words, the evidence we see in the text itself seems to indicate that someone is copying from someone, and the only question then is, who is first? Of course, if you just read the Bible as, of course, Exodus was written before Kings, then of course Aaron is first. But we know that the chances are pretty good that Exodus was written at least at the same time or later than Kings. And therefore, we can't just use chronology to say this one was first or that one was first. Modern scholarship generally considers that the Jeroboam story in Kings is used in the Aaron story, creating this grammatical issue of your gods when there's only one calf. It's also interesting to note that in both cases, Aaron and Jeroboam, excuse me, both created the golden images as depictions of the throne of Yahweh. So what we're really dealing with here is not an idol of another god in the case of Jeroboam, for sure. And I think so, therefore, also in the case of Aaron, because it explains a lot about the story. These are not images depicting other idols, other gods. They're images depicting and representing Yahweh. And it seems like in the older Yahwism, people depicted Yahweh in images, in possibly standing stones, and also possibly represented by a golden calf. So, this explains why a story about a heretical Aaron is found in the same book as a story about Aaron, who is the consecrated, chosen, and legitimate high priest. We have two traditions, one from the northern tribes, one from the southern tribes, coming together in Exodus. But why would a reworked story of Jeroboam find its way into Exodus? It makes sense that a northern priestly writer, which is opposed to the Jerusalem, Judah, Zadokite priesthood, would take a story originally used to vilify Jeroboam and rewrite it into a story about Aaron as originator of the problem and not really Jeroboam, undermining the southern Israel Zadokite priests and their claim as the only legitimate priesthood. It's satire and it's kind of parody, and it's also brilliant. And both traditions are preserved by the final editors of the Pentateuch. So if we go back to the Exodus calf, it's quite a serious thing that's going on here. They've made this calf now. Moses is up in the mountain. Even if this calf is a representative of Yahweh who brought them out of Egypt, it's still a huge problem because they're not supposed to make images, right? As mentioned earlier, the golden calf rebellion comes right after the tabernacle is created. And this is also a parallel with right after Eden is created, with Adam and Eve in there. And we are told about paradise and the creation. There is the rebellion that takes place by Adam and Eve. And this could also be a very strong parallel with that. Of course, excuse me, I've lost my place here. Yes, okay. So this begins a train of thought that carries through to the end of this section. Yahweh is besides himself of anger. Now, so the God Yahweh is incredibly angry because they've just disobeyed the first commandment after agreeing to obey all the commandments. Moses has to step in, and if he didn't step in, according to the story, Yahweh would have wiped out all of Israel, right? Literally said, cheers. Now, this makes sense to us according to the character of Yahweh that's portrayed in Genesis. In Genesis, when humankind becomes utterly violent, sinful, unrighteous, he wipes them out and he starts again with Noah. And this seems to be a play on the same type of situation. And in paraphrasing wildly, God is basically saying to Moses, listen, I'll wipe these oaks out. And me and you go on, and we fulfill the promise. Me and you, we can still do it, but we don't need these guys. But Moses steps in like a priest should, a mediator between God and people. And he manipulates. This is the weird part about the story, but it is very characteristic of early portrayals of Yahweh and every other god of this era. They can be manipulated. They can be talked out of what they want to do because they are not, in a sense, perfect. There's better arguments than what they can come up with. And in this case, Moses comes up with a better argument. And to some sense, guys, I know this sounds terrible, but I want to say in Afrikaans, hy streel sy ego. What's the right way to say this in English? He's playing on Yahweh's ego to make him not kill everyone. Now, Yahweh ends up not killing all the Israelites, not because he's merciful, but because he's worried about his reputation. It's terrible. It's terrible. Anyway, so Moses manipulates God, right? His argument is a simple one. What are the Egyptians going to say of you if you kill everyone now? Like, what about your reputation? Oh, yeah, no, I didn't think about that. I needed to think about my reputation. Yeah, no, you got a point there. Moses is talking to another human here. This is exactly what another human would do. A human that's bent on getting his way through force and is worried about his reputation. This is not the portrayal of a God of love that the New Testament seems to point towards in the life of Jesus. I'm sorry, it's not. Israel's betrayal has threatened their very existence. But Moses' argument works and God changes his mind. I want to say this again because this is rather important. God morphs, God evolves throughout the Old Testament. And the very early portrayals that we find, for instance, in the Torah, we have God very human-like. He walks in the garden, he talks, he makes clothes, he changes his mind. He gets so upset that he destroys. He's vengeful, he's jealous. He's basically a portrayal of what an ancient, very powerful warrior king would be. That's how God is portrayed by the Torah. Yes, of course, merciful to those who obey and submit. He is kind to those who love him and obey. But if you double cross him, if you disobey him, you are absolutely toast. And it's this kind of behavior. We see this in human behavior, in very strong, dominant people, autocratic, dictatorial type of leaders, where I'll be good to those who are good to me, and I will destroy those who come at me. Think of some real prominent leaders in the world at the moment that this is how they think. This doesn't seem to be the mindset of Jesus as far as we can see from the New Testament. A very simple quote like loving your enemies immediately puts these two personalities at complete odds. It's no wonder that there were Christians in the second century already that said, no, wait a minute. Well, their conclusion was the God of the Old Testament is the evil God, and the God of the Father of Jesus is the good God. That's not my conclusion. Those are the Marcionites, but that's not my conclusion. My conclusion on all of this is that the Torah misrepresents God because it is written by people, ancient, Iron Age people who did not understand God, who did not really know God, and really had a very primitive view according and in the likeness of all the other surrounding cultures around that God warrior type king with toast. So God changes his mind. Now, by these ancient writers as someone is some to be bargained with, right? Convinced by arguments, he changes his mind because he realizes his first idea was not that great. Guys, come on, this is not God. What will others say? Is this really how we as Christians view God today? And the answer is no. Most Christians don't view God like this, but still hold to the Old Testament as a word for word, the words of God. It just doesn't work, guys. It doesn't work. It does seem that this characterization of God can be found in several places in Genesis and Exodus, and the examples are numerous, and they are not limited to Exodus and Genesis. And the writer of this book says, and if we cannot see that what's going here is man painting God in his own idealized image, there is no hope for us. And I think this is true. Now, Moses goes back down the mountain with Joshua. They've missed the party. And what type of party do you have? In Afrikaans say hulle het uitgeraak. They were losing it down there. What they were busy with, nobody knows. It's normally portrayed as like sacrifices and dancing and like orgies and like the most terrible things. Well, the things we today will say, no, can't do that, pagan stuff. That's probably what they were going on. And it was hectic, right? Moses gets down. He smashes the tablets. He grinds the calf into dust. He mixes it with water and he makes the people drink the stuff. Like, it's so hectic. This is another truly odd moment for modern readers. But this is a way in which Moses pronounces guilt on the drinkers of the dust, and he humiliates the calf god. We think of another example in Numbers 5, verse 12:31, where a woman is made to drink a concoction of water and dust to determine whether she's guilty of adultery or not. Well, they drink this water, they are guilty of adultery, right? So then Moses confronts Aaron, admits to be overcome by social pressure. His excuse is absolutely hilarious. He threw some gold in the fire, and out came a golden calf. Right? Very, very creative. And Moses is aided by the tribe of Levites, and they kill 3,000 Israelites. And this is where the legitimacy of the Levites come into place. Why are they the special tribe that have to be priests? Why do they get to be those who own no land but can eat the tithes and work in the temple, and only from them can the priesthood come? Well, simply, here they side with Moses, and they help Moses kill 3,000 Israelites with their own swords. So thus they secure a blessing from God as the priestly tribe. Now, the next day Moses goes back up the mountain to see if he can somehow make atonement for the people's sin. Would at least brought some type of atonement. You know, in those days, blood brought atonement. There had to be some form of sacrifice for the God to be appeased. And in this case, the blood of 3,000 people was shed that night. And God obviously approves of it, because otherwise the priests would not have gotten a blessing. And it's not like God comes and says to Moses, what have you done? You've just, I don't know which law, but one of the 10 commandments says, you shall not kill. What have you done? No. This type of killing is all sharp. No problem with this type of killing. Kills 3,000 people, but still feels the need to go up and make atonement. In other words, to get God off his absolute fit and range. So Moses offers his own life, but God's not interested in this. And besides the killing of 3,000, he decides the best way to deal with the Israelites is he's going to plague them, right? Because they made the calf, the one Aaron made. So with a plague, God reminds them then of Egypt and what will happen to them if they continue along this path of disobedience. He will make them feel like Egyptians and put the 10 plagues on them, basically. In the next scene, God comes to a decision. Israel can proceed, can take the land of Canaan as planned, but they're going to be led by an angel. God's not coming along because he doesn't want to lose control and consume the whole bunch of them along the way. People are grieved at the thought, and so at God's command, they take off their ornaments and they have to leave them behind at Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. Why? Because just they make another calf. But first, Moses has to make a plea with God to try and convince God to come with them into Canaan. So I'm going to leave you here. This is the episode of the golden calf and the repercussions of disobedience here. But once again, it gives us a very clear picture that the story of Exodus is written from a much later point. And it takes into account things that were written and happened much later. In this case, Jeroboam's 2 calves of gold in the northern kingdom. And this, together with so many other things we've already mentioned, is evidence that points in the direction, at least, that the writers of Exodus are not writing history. They are writing a religious, political polemic that tells their audience who God is, how he operates, why they have the traditions they have, why they have the people leading them they have, why they have a priesthood, why they have a temple, why they have a king, I guess not so much, why sacrifice is necessary, why they have to obey the law, otherwise the curses and the blessings. It just all kind of mounts and gives us a picture that if there is a kernel of history that sits in Exodus, it was greatly embellished with later contextual and contemporary ideas. And to read Exodus as clear history is a mistake. Right, I'm going to end here. I'll see you next week. Cheers, guys.